From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Luntz.
Nikki Haley's big money donors are closing their wallets after her crushing defeat in South Carolina over the weekend. With Donald Trump's path to the Republican presidential nomination looking more clear, pollster Frank Luntz will join to discuss the GOP race with the Michigan primary tomorrow.
President Biden and the Big Four congressional leaders set to meet at the White House tomorrow with a shutdown deadline looming and the administration pushing the House to pass aid for Ukraine. Melinda Haring of the Atlantic Council will have more on the state of that war.
And a lawsuit filed by the FTC, 8 states, and Washington, D.C. over the merger of grocery chains Albertsons and Kroger. We'll talk about it with Douglas Farrar, Director of Public Affairs for the FTC. Indeed, we'll get to the grocery store later this hour, Kaylee, but the campaign trail is where we begin.
Yes.
After an unprecedented string of victories for Donald Trump.
Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, now South Carolina. Granted, that was widely expected. And we actually thought Nikki Haley might lose by a greater margin than she did. The margin was 20 points. 40% of primary voters voted for her. And she says that suggests something, as she told supporters over the weekend that she's staying in this race.
There are huge numbers of voters in our Republican primaries who are saying they want an alternative. I'm not giving up this fight when a majority of Americans disapprove of both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. We're headed to Michigan tomorrow. And we're headed to the Super Tuesday states throughout all of next week.
Joining us now, Bloomberg's Mike Dorning and Laura Davison here at the table on Balance of Power. Laura, we'll start with you on the campaign trail here. Thanks to both of you for being with us. The big question, of course, everyone asking is how long can Nikki Haley stay in this race? We're seeing the Koch brothers steer their money to down ballot to other races. She's got a lot of meetings set up with big donors between now and Super Tuesday. Is that the real last stand?
Yeah, so she has 10 fundraisers set over 10 days, but these are not the big dollar Wall Street fundraisers she was having, just a month ago. Yeah. These are some, the price tickets on some of these are, around $1,000. There's even one later this week that's $5 to attend. So much smaller dollars that we're talking about here. And really, this is sort of the signal of the end of her campaign. Haley herself and her campaign manager said last week that they haven't even thought what comes beyond Super Tuesday. That's March 5th. So that's, just basically a week away from now. All the signs are that, she's going to close up shop here very quickly in the next week or two.
Well, and to that point, Laura, even as she says that clearly the numbers show there are a certain number of Republican primary voters who would not like Donald Trump to be the nominee, even if she were to go on securing 40% of the vote in Super Tuesday states, the delegate math just simply cannot work for her. There's no path unless she wins outright, right?
Yeah, the math, if you look at it, Trump will either get the nomination by March 12th or March 19th. So really, it's just a numbers game at this time. The advantage for Haley is because in these states, if you win, a percentage of the vote, you usually get a percentage of the delegate. Not for all cases, but in some cases. So the longer she runs, the more delegates that she can rack up. And in the event of, some sort of legal issue or health issue or anything else that would disqualify Trump from running, she would be the obvious person to potentially go in and take that spot. Doesn't guarantee her the nomination, but she would be well positioned for it.
Well, let's hear from Donald Trump. The former president took a victory lap early on Saturday in South Carolina. Here he is.
There's never been a spirit like this. And I just want to say that I have never seen the Republican Party so unified as it is right now. Never been like that.
Okay. So let's just get back to the fact, as Kaylee mentioned, that Nikki Haley got 40%. Is that the vision of unity for someone who's running like an incumbent?
You know, these are not great numbers for Trump. You know, he is winning by wide margins, but there's still, as Haley has pointed out, you know, a significant number of Republicans who want somebody else. And this is not a good sign for him going into some of these swing states where, you know, if you have a disunited party, you know, in some of these places like Michigan or Nevada, the actual party apparatus is at war with one another. So there's a lot of headwinds for Trump, you know, not to mention he's facing his own money woes.
That could haunt him in the general,
Well, and we consider the idea of Republican Party unity. I'm not sure we see that on consistent display when it comes to the Republican Party on Capitol Hill. Certainly, if you think about the different Republican conferences in the Senate and in the House, Mike, of course, we come into this week realizing we may be facing a partial government shutdown at the end of it. Is there any sign to this point that is going to be avoided, and how?
Well, Mitch McConnell was just on the Senate floor saying we're not going to have a shutdown. We don't need to have one. Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, clearly does not want one. But just like you're seeing in the presidential primary where 40% of the party isn't with the incumbent president, you're seeing in the House a huge portion of the House Republicans that are dissenting from what Mike Johnson is trying to do here, and they're pushing a specific agenda. So the whole House and presidential primary, you know, the Republicans are at war with each other, and that's reflected in this disagreements about spending and is reflected in the disagreements about Ukraine.
Tom Emmer, the majority whip, told us on this program, 2 weeks ago at this point, Kaylee, no more CRs, and no, the government will not shut down. They'll have 3 days when they get back. Can they have both?
I think it's going to be really hard. They were trying to do something over the weekend where they would actually agree on permanent funding for the rest of the year for the parts of the government that are about to shut down at the end of the week. They haven't been able to agree on that so far, and just getting that through is going to take a long time. I think it's probably a contest between whether they have another temporary extension, what we in Washington call a CR, kick the can down the road a bit, or shut the government down. My money would be kick the can down the road, mainly because we've been through this drama so many times this year. Every time at the end, we go to down to the wire, and then we kick the can down the road a little longer.
Well, this would be the fourth kick of the same can.
Yeah, the can's getting used to being kicked.
Yes, it is.
And like you talk to traders on Wall Street, and they're like, yeah, you know, we're not worried about it. We've seen this too many times before.
Or are they whistling past the graveyard?
Well, that is the question. And, of course, President Biden is going to become more engaged in these conversations when he hosts the big four congressional leaders. That would be McConnell, Schumer, Jeffries, and Johnson at the White House tomorrow. Is that going to be something more focused on keeping the government open or about trying to get supplemental aid package, including funding for Ukraine, across the line? What's the administration's priority here?
The administration's priority is focusing on the Ukraine problem. They're also going to be trying to keep the government open, whether it's temporarily or long term. But the key political dilemma for the entire Biden administration right now is keeping the Ukraine funding going so that that war doesn't sort of fall apart in the next few weeks. They're also looking to do something on the border that will address a big political problem for them. People are upset about what's going on the border, and that is a piece of these talks. If the Biden administration just lets that fester all year, that's not going to be good for his reelection.
Let's bring Laura back into the conversation, because we've got a primary tomorrow, and Donald Trump and Nikki Haley are not the only ones in it. We've got Joe Biden, again, spinning a couple of different plates here as he's having this meeting with the leadership in the House and the Senate. His surrogates are going to be working in Michigan, where he's been up against the wall here because of his Israel policy. All of these stories connect in pretty fascinating ways, as he's going to be talking to the speaker about that supplemental budget request. How concerned should he be about this movement to vote uncommitted by Democrats?
This is a little bit of a scary thing for Joe Biden. Michigan has a large Arab American community, very upset about his handling of the Gaza fighting. And this is where Biden's coalition could really start to crack. Of course, Michigan is a very key state for the general election. Being a swing state will have a ton of attention on it. And if he is not able to, kind of figure out how to make these different portions of his coalition happy, he could have a lot of trouble in November. So this is a first sign we'll see, of how many people actually go out and vote uncommitted. We saw that efforts for that in New Hampshire didn't really pan out. Yeah. But, the new state, and this is more about something more existential for a lot of these voters.
All right. Well, we're looking forward to coverage of that and, of course, the Big Four congressional meeting tomorrow as well. Our thanks to Bloomberg's Mike Dorning and Laura Davison for joining us this evening. Now, coming up, the Federal Trade Commission is suing to block a grocery mega merger. We'll speak with Douglas Farrar, the FTC Director of the Office of Public Affairs, next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. The Federal Trade Commission is suing to block what would be the largest grocery store merger in U.S. history. Kroger is trying to acquire its rival Albertsons for $24.6 billion. And 8 states and the District of Columbia have joined the FTC in a filing today. It alleges the proposed deal would hamper competition and raise prices for consumers. In a statement, an Albertsons spokesman said the deal would help the supermarkets compete with retailers like Amazon and Walmart, calling these the, quote, very companies the FTC claims to be reining in. For more, Douglas Farrar is joining us now. He is the director of the FTC's Office of Public Affairs and is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. So, Douglas, thanks so much for coming in. To the point made by Albertsons in the aftermath of this today, by trying to stop this merger on the grounds that it is anti-competitive, is this actually still feeding into anti-competitive behavior for the likes of an Amazon or a Walmart?
Well, thanks so much for having me on the show. I would say no. Kroger and Albertsons view each other as their number one competitor. And the effect of that competition is to lower prices for consumers on important goods like bread, eggs, milk. And it also allows workers to compete better for benefits, wages, working conditions. So really, no, the answer is competition is good. And if we don't stop to block this merger, then there'll be less competition and big price effects for folks who need to buy groceries.
To what extent was the FTC influenced by the lessons learned from Albertsons' acquisition of Safeway? This is 2014, which I'm sure we all remember. There was a big promise for stores to be sold that did not become reality because the buyer went bankrupt. Did that factor into this decision?
Certainly, history is an important guide for when we're reviewing mergers. You're right, that merger remedy failed. The proposed merger remedy for Kroger and Albertsons this time had similar concerns. This is a remedy constructed by antitrust lawyers trying to get a mega merger through and not provide a real opportunity for a business acquiring the divested stores to make a go at a newly merged competitor. So, yes, that was a big factor as we considered the proposed divestiture.
Yeah, one of the grounds the FTC was on in bringing this lawsuit was not just about the higher prices or the impact it could have on employees, but the idea that that remedy was insufficient. Is that more about the potential buyers or what it was that Kroger and Albertsons were willing to offload? What would make that remedy acceptable to the FTC? What would need to change?
Well, it's a little bit of both. The remedy itself is several hundred stores, but again, it's designed by antitrust attorneys looking to get a merger through. It's not designed to be a standalone business. And the company they proposed to give it to, C&S Wholesalers, currently operates only 23 grocery stores and 1 pharmacy. So the learning curve there is really tremendous for them. And they'd be facing the largest ever merged grocery store in America, right? So the chances they can compete effectively with a business that's almost set up to fail is very low.
So is the answer more stores then? What would meet the definition of what could be a standalone company?
I think the answer is what you saw the FTC do today, which is act to block the merger. Right?
There is no answer.
Well, I think the answer is competition, and we see that competition between Kroger and Albertsons lowers prices and increases wages for workers. The remedy bears a lot of risks. You pointed out the Hagen's proposed or divestiture and Safeway Albertsons failed. Those stores failed, and many of those stores failed, and the remainder were sold back at pennies on the dollar. Mm-hmm. The American public bears the cost of that failed remedy, and we don't want to see that repeat itself.
Well, and it's not just the FTC that would not like to see it. As we mentioned, 8 other states and here where we are, the District of Columbia, have joined you in this suit. But there also have been suits brought by Washington and Colorado, state attorneys general there. Why aren't they part of this? How are these two, or your suit and theirs, supposed to work together?
Well, those suits by Colorado and Washington are brought in state court, and certainly it's good to see states take actions that we agree with. Obviously, we hoped they would follow with us, but right now we're focused on winning our lawsuit, which would create a national solution to this merger versus a state-by-state solution.
Kroger says the ruling makes it more likely that consumers will face higher prices, and I think this gets back to their competitive argument against the Walmarts and Amazons of the world. But they point out the fact that they've raised or lowered prices, rather, every year since 2003. And they had pledged to do the same under this newly combined company. Did the FTC believe that pledge? Was that a credible promise?
Well, what I would say is that these companies are very profitable and they could lower prices at any time. Albertsons paid a very large divestiture to shareholders a little earlier last year. And, if you look at history, there's been mergers in grocery stores before. Yale University published a study that showed that a large merger ended up with a 5% price hike on goods across the board, but especially goods for people with low incomes who are buying things like milk, eggs, and bread. And so, our concern is that prices will go up, and there's a lot of evidence to indicate that that's a likely outcome of this merger.
Douglas Farrar, we appreciate your being with us. He's director of the FTC's Office of Public Affairs. Good to see you today on Bloomberg. As we turn our attention back to politics now, and Nikki Haley's loss in her home state's primary over the weekend, in which she gathered 40% of the vote. There'll be more of this coming up.
The biggest problem that Trump has is not that they're going to go over and vote for Biden, but that they just won't show up. And turnout, I think, is really going to be the key issue in determining who wins the election this fall. Say 5% of those Republican voters who voted for Haley don't show up in November. Donald Trump will lose.
That was Andrew Smith of the University of New Hampshire Survey Center. And it's where we start our conversation with Frank Luntz, founder and CEO of FIL Inc, longtime pollster and political analyst. Frank, it's great to see you. We talked coming out of New Hampshire about how it felt like the beginning of the general election. Now that Nikki Haley has lost in her home state like this, we thought it might feel different once that happened as well. She says she's in this through Super Tuesday. Is that the last stand?
She probably is, because she wants to be. But there's no demand for her right now. The politics have changed. The public is now looking towards November, and both Donald Trump and Joe Biden have horrific weaknesses within their base that could cause the other candidate to win. Among Trump voters, there is 15 or 20% that voted for Nikki Haley that doesn't want Trump elected. They tend to be in the suburbs, in the wealthier areas, upper middle class areas, particularly among women. Younger women, 18 to 39. However, with Biden, he's losing union members. He's losing Latinos. He's even having trouble among young African-American males. And all three of those groups tend to vote Democratic, but don't like Joe Biden. So both candidates have significant weaknesses. And frankly, I think this is going to be a tremendously chaotic campaign over the next 9 months.
Well, but when you look at the numbers Biden has put up in primaries thus far, where there are other contenders, other options available, like Dean Phillips, the congressman from Minnesota, he is still polling a significantly larger majority than Donald Trump is right now. If you're inside the Trump campaign, how concerned would you be by the fact that Nikki Haley was able to poll 40%, not just in South Carolina, but in New Hampshire as well?
Just about every survey is Donald Trump beating Joe Biden. And we're not looking at national numbers because in the end, it's not a national campaign. It's a local campaign. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, New Hampshire, Nevada. In these swing states, the polling has been really bad for Joe Biden over the last few weeks, in fact, a few months. That Donald Trump is winning almost all of these swing states. Remember, Biden beat Trump in 2020 by 4.5%. Most surveys have Trump winning by about 3%. That's a 7.5% swing to Trump. Inflation is down. The economy is stronger. For every possible reason, Trump has been indicted 91 times, and yet he's beating Joe Biden. What's going to happen when we get to the fall, when we get to the debates, when we get to the real contest? Donald Trump should be losing to Joe Biden by a significant amount, and he's winning. And he's winning in the key states. Yes, Trump strategists are nervous. Biden strategists are apoplectic.
Well, we're going to turn our attention, Frank, to a state tomorrow that could decide the next president of the United States, with a primary in Michigan. Of course, they're separate contests, but with Donald Trump expected to beat Nikki Haley yet again, and we should note, by the way, the unprecedented nature of his string of victories so far. Joe Biden's facing this uncommitted movement by progressive Democrats who are not happy with his policies in Israel, more specifically in Gaza. If this is a tough number for Joe Biden tomorrow, what does this tell us about the general?
Here's the problem. I'm not convinced that any of these primaries tell us anything about the general, because in the end, it's going to be the independents, those people who often don't participate in primaries, where they go is going to decide what happens in November. Trump has an ethical challenge. Joe Biden has an age challenge. Trump is better able to challenge in his weakness, because in the end, we don't know if any of these trials are going to take place, if anything is going to be decided by Election Day. Trump's been very successful in pushing this stuff off. We do know that anywhere from 75% to 80% of Americans think that Joe Biden is too old and should not be running for re-election. So you are correct. Bloomberg is correct that both candidates have this tremendous weakness that in any other election campaign would destroy them. But because both of them have the weakness, it's the equivalent of a snake and a mongoose locked in this death grab, this death spiral. And in the end, it's the American people who are hurt. It's the American people who are disappointed, angry with the political process. And one last point, I've never seen so many people wish both candidates were not running. 70% don't want Trump, don't want Biden. This is a problem for our country going forward.
So, Frank, is ultimately this election going to be one that comes down to turnout and to turnout only?
That's a good question. In the end, 1% of America is going to decide who the other 99% are going to live with, because it's only the undecided, and that's just about 5% of the electorate, and it's only in 11 states that are truly up for grabs. So 1% in 11 states. We've never had an election where so few people will have such a big impact on the entire country.
Remarkable. I don't know if you see Nikki Haley dropping out a week from tomorrow night, Frank, but no labels might be waiting with open arms. We saw commentary today from Joe Cunningham. Haley is, quote, someone we'd definitely be interested in, unquote. I know that we're talking about a tried and true Republican here, but they did want a unity ticket with a Republican. Could that happen?
It absolutely could happen. I know from my own polling that up to 70% of Americans will consider a no labels and independent candidates, and 40% want to vote for that individual, are looking for the alternative. The highest level an independent received up to this point is 19% in 1992. That number is double today. And in fact, I believe that a credible candidate who is known by the country actually starts at 20% of the vote. We are in uncharted territory. Make no mistake. You're correct that turnout does matter. But when you have 70% that are refusing to accept who the candidates we have right now, when you have the number one issue, which is now immigration, where the public is wishing a pox on both sides, we've never seen this kind of election before.
Frank, when you talk about a credible candidate who could secure that share of the vote, is RFK Jr. credible? We saw Quinnipiac's polling last week that suggested he would get 15 if it was him, Trump, and Biden.
And actually, I'm projecting with our own surveys that Kennedy is at the 10% level. And at 10%, you don't make the presidential debates. And that's what's key. If you're not in the debates, you're not relevant. So Bobby Kennedy is an important statistic. But if he's not in the debates, then he doesn't have that credibility that he's looking for. Chris Christie, I've heard Chris Christie's name being mentioned. Yes, I've heard Nikki Haley's name being mentioned. John Huntsman from Utah. Senator Cassidy from Louisiana. There are a number of statewide political figures that could fit the bill here. The question is, how effective is their announcement? Does the public see that they're legitimate? And they hit the ground running on day one? I believe that the next 30 days are going to be incredible for those of us who follow the election, and it's very hard to predict what will happen.
All right, Frank Luntz of FIL Inc, thank you so much for joining us. Coming up, we'll turn to the war in Ukraine, be joined by Melinda Haring of the Atlantic Council as that war enters its third year. This is Bloomberg.
The city that everyone's watching that's in ruins, that the Russians are likely to take by the end of the month, is Avdiivka. And that will be one more city in eastern Ukraine where there's absolutely nothing left. But then the line will continue to ebb away.
That was Melinda Haring, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, on with us a few weeks ago, just before Avdiivka did indeed fall. And she's joining us now once again. Melinda, always great to have you on the program. Your predictions often do prove quite prescient. So give us the reality check on the ground now. As Ukraine enters this third year of its war with Russia, how vulnerable is it?
Hi, Kylie. Thanks for having me back. So Ukraine is at a pivotal moment, and I know everyone says that, but it's very true this time. Ukraine is running out of ammunition, and it's having a hard time holding the line. I'm really worried about the defensive fortifications and whether they can keep the Russians in place. But I'm also worried that the West is making a lot of promises. So we just had the Munich Security Conference, and the mood there was grim. People tell me it was like a funeral. Everyone's freaking out about European security, but no one's actually doing very much about it. There's a lot of hand-wringing, and Emmanuel Macron is doing more hand-wringing in Paris today, but they're not actually turning up the heat and providing Ukraine with the ammunition that it needs now.
We actually spoke with the foreign minister of Poland about that very issue, and he was adamant about the fact that our European allies are making more progress on the delivery of shells. This seems to be a point of contention in Europe. Melinda, what else do you know about it?
So, Joe, the EU pledged that they would deliver 1 million shells by the end of this month, and they're at 330,000, and they're under a lot of pressure to increase that figure, but I don't think they're going to make it. Today, Zelensky called them out on it, and he's mad as hell, and he should be. The bottom line is that Europe, if it made a moral decision, could find the shells. It has the shells, it's just selling them to other places. So if Europe is really concerned about its own security, it should cancel these commercial orders, and it should send the shells to Ukraine as soon as possible. Now, let's not let the Americans off easy either. Congress has been sitting on its hands for months and months, and you guys have been following the story. The story is getting more and more complicated. Since we last spoke, Representative Fitzpatrick has put a new wrinkle into it. The Senate passed the Ukraine bill, and we're waiting on the House to respond. Representative Mike Johnson is refusing to bring that bill to the floor. So after the Munich Security Conference, Brian Fitzpatrick is mad, and for good reason, and he's proposed a different bill that is coming from the House side. However, this is not a great option. It's not as much money. It doesn't have humanitarian support. It doesn't have budget support for Ukraine. Let me make an obvious point. You can give Ukraine all the weapons it needs, but if you don't give them budget support, the economy is not going to hold. And it's unlikely to pass the Senate. So it's really a distraction from the Senate bill that needs to pass as soon as possible.
Well, President Vladimir Zelensky certainly still seems like he's trying to hang on to some optimism about congressional action. He spoke yesterday about what is going to happen with U.S. aid. Just take a listen, Melinda.
Hope for the Congress exists, and I am confident the outcome will be positive. We are counting on their support. They know we need their support within the month.
Within the month may be a tough ask, Melinda, given the other things that Congress needs to work on in the interim, including trying to keep the U.S. government open So if they don't get the U.S. support, what alternatives does Ukraine realistically have?
So Ukraine is committed to, or Ukraine is confident that it's going to get this U.S. assistance, and I'm confident that it will pass. The whole process has been very, very long and far too long, but the votes are there, as we've discussed many times. It's a matter of getting the bill on the floor. What happens if it doesn't pass? Well, President Zelensky says they lose. He told Chuck Schumer, it's this simple. If I don't get the U.S. assistance, the $62 billion this year, Ukraine will lose. Will it continue to fight? Yes. But it's going to change our world. It's going to change European security. It's going to change the American way of life. Europe is the biggest trade partner of the United States. It's going to make all of our consumer goods go up. It's going to change our way of life in the sort of easy way that we can just, get on a plane and go to Europe. It's going to help us. It's going to massively reshape our security environment, but it's also the moral thing to do. 40 million Ukrainians are counting on us to send them this ammunition so that they can defend their borders. It's a very simple calculation.
Mm-hmm. After we spoke with Poland's Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski last week, Melinda, he responded to comments by the Russian ambassador to the UN at the Security Council meeting. This took place Friday. Let's listen.
He says that Russia has always only beaten back aggression. What were Russian troops doing at the gates of Warsaw in August 1920? They were on a topographical excursion? No, the truth is that for every time that Russia has been invaded, she has invaded 10 times. What the ambassador has achieved is to remind us why we resisted Soviet domination and what Ukraine is resisting now. They failed to subjugate us then, they'll fail to subjugate Ukraine and us now.
He had a lot more to say to us in our conversation, Melinda, that if the U.S. does not provide funding for Ukraine, that it could be a game changer in Europe to the extent that some NATO members, in fact, might begin their own nuclear programs. Do you agree?
Yes, that's one of the concerns, Joe. So there's at least 3 Western European governments that are planning for what happens if Donald Trump is elected. I know that's a little bit unrelated, but the Europeans are very freaked out about their security. They're afraid that the U.S. is not going to deliver on its promises, and it may undermine that it's going to not support Ukraine with this assistance package, and then it will basically pull away from NATO. So Western Europe is very scared right now, and I think they have every reason to be so.
Well, as we talk about NATO, an alliance that the U.S., via the articles of it, is technically committed to putting its troops on the ground, to sending support if one of those alliances would be attacked. That commitment does not exist for Ukraine. No U.S. boots have touched down on Ukrainian soil as a result of this war. So as we talk about the idea that, sure, the U.S. maybe will approve sending more weapons, perhaps even more budgetary aid, what the U.S. very likely will not be sending is more men. And especially in light of President Zelensky saying over the weekend that 31,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died in this conflict. Is this a personnel issue as well?
Kylie, so Ukraine has had its troops on the front line for more than 2 years now, and Ukrainian troops have fought with a lot of heroism, but they're very tired and they need a rotation. So this is a big issue in Ukraine now, and we're expecting Ukraine's parliament to pass a new mobilization law to give those soldiers on the front lines relief. Do they have enough people to fight? Yes, they do. The last statistic I heard was that Ukraine has at least 12% more people who could fight within the economy, and the economy can stay afloat. So it's a matter of coming up with a system that gives the guys at the front line relief and giving the new guys training and getting them out there to the front lines. But they do have the people.
Reminding us of the dire situation at the moment in Ukraine. Melinda Haring, it's great to see you. Melinda, thank you for joining us, as always.
Thank you.
Coming up, we'll assemble our political panel to dive into Donald Trump's overwhelming victory in the South Carolina Republican primary over the weekend. It's only here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Today in South Carolina, we're getting around 40% of the vote. That's about what we got in New Hampshire, too. I'm going to count it. I know 40% is not 50%, but I also know 40% is not some tiny group. There are huge numbers of voters in our Republican primaries who are saying they want an alternative. I said earlier this week that no matter what happens in South Carolina, I would continue to run for president. I'm a woman of my word.
Nikki Haley in Charleston, after losing her home state's primary by a lot. She did the math for you there. And joining us now, our political panel. Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, is back with us this week. And Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University, joins from New York. Rick and Jeannie, great to see you. Good Monday, coming off a primary that could really, in the rearview mirror, end up appearing decisive. Rick, what do you think of that rationale as a reason to stay in?
Look, I mean, it's an authentic rationale, especially if you consider Donald Trump an incumbent and sort of running as an incumbent. It actually looks weak. If you consider this sort of an open primary race where there have been half a dozen candidates who have tried and failed, she looks weak. So it just depends on what your perspective is. Obviously, her perspective is I'm running against an incumbent. He controls the party. 40% of the party doesn't want this guy, and she can continue to combat his in the campaign to try and prove that she's got standing in the party, whether it's for this cycle or some future cycle.
Well, her ability to continue doing that in this current cycle was going to be dependent on the fact that she still has resources to do so. And what we've seen in the aftermath of South Carolina is the Koch network turning away from her. Other big money donors who had backed her at least once before, like Ken Griffin, together with Koch, have said, we're looking down ballot. This is pretty much done and dusted, it seems. So can Nikki Haley realistically go past Super Tuesday? She's committed to getting there. Then what?
Yeah, I think that her campaign speaks for itself. They're only committed to going through Super Tuesday. Unlike New Hampshire, where she said she'd stay in through Super Tuesday, South Carolina, I'm staying in through Super Tuesday. She's making no predictions on what happens after Super Tuesday. She does have 10 fundraising events scheduled this next 10 days to help fuel that campaign spend. She's going to see whether or not there's enough capacity to run a campaign. Unlikely, especially on the same level that she's been used to. As you point out, a lot of the big major donors who put money into her super PAC, that have been waging most of the media war against Donald Trump, they've got to have ammunition if they're going to be able to make an impact. And without money, they have no ammo.
Well, on Friday, Donald Trump talked about his appeal to black voters. This was at the Black Conservative Federation Gala in South Carolina, and adds to the narrative here going into the general election. Let's listen to what he said.
I think that's why the black people are so much on my side now, because they see what's happening to me happens to them. Does that make sense? I've heard that. The mugshot, we've all seen the mugshot. And you know who embraced it more than anybody else? The black population. It's incredible.
You have to play the tape to believe it, Jeannie. And that comes along with a headline we just posted on the terminal. Trump favorability rating highest since 2022, with Biden near low. What is Joe Biden doing wrong to not be able to turn this narrative around?
You know, they tried over the last year to talk positively about what he's done, and he does have a really strong record, but they have not been able to break through. And so I think what we're seeing with Joe Biden going to the border this week is they are going to now try to point the finger in the other direction. And quite frankly, that's what this campaign is going to be. It is going to be, I think, one of the most negative campaigns we've had in the modern era. Donald Trump, for having higher favorability, is still wildly unpopular. And Nikki Haley getting 40% in South Carolina is a sign of that. That means 4 out of 10 really conservative Republicans who went to the polls in South Carolina, or mildly Republican, conservative Republicans, wanted somebody other than Donald Trump. And when you look at those exit polls, many of her supporters said, we didn't go to vote for her, we went to vote against him. So Joe Biden will be pointing the finger at Trump. Do you really want this guy who says things like you just played? And Donald Trump will be pointing the finger at Joe Biden, calling him old and out of step and all of these kinds of things. And that's what we're going to get for the next several months as we experience this really long general election.
Well, Jeannie, right to point out that both Trump and Biden will be visiting the border in Texas come Thursday, although they will be a couple hundred miles apart. But he's had some choice words on migrants and immigrants as well, Rick, in addition to the clip we just saw from Friday. It does not seem to be hurting his standing with most Republican primary voters. But will it come back to bite him in this general election in the way it didn't necessarily in 2016 or come close to in 2020?
Yeah, part of what you have to understand is I think Donald Trump is completely dominating the agenda, right? He attacks Nikki Haley, she responds. He attacks the president of the United States, he responds. There are very few people who are getting ahead of him on an issue. He is driving the issue set. One of the reasons that immigration is the number one issue in America is because Donald Trump is making it the number one issue in America because he sees a vulnerability in Biden actually getting ahead of the economic surge. So the reality is until someone actually starts to run a campaign against Donald Trump, you should plan on him being more popular than everybody else, winning more primaries than anybody else. I mean, he is enjoying setting the pace. And when you set the pace as a campaign, it's very hard for those people who are competing against you to be able to challenge you. And that's the dynamic we're seeing right now in both the primary and the general election going forward. Why the president of the United States didn't use the last 2 weeks that Congress was out to go on a trip through these targeted states, all of which he is losing right now, and make the case against Donald Trump while Donald Trump's still in a primary. I mean, to me, that's politics 101, and the White House just isn't getting it.
Well, we will have more on what's going on in the White House. Not necessarily more on 2024, as we just hit that plenty with Rick and Jeannie. But tomorrow, there'll be a meeting at the White House with the big four congressional leaders. We got to talk about that coming up, as a partial government shutdown could be looming at the end of this week. We'll be back with our political panel next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. President Biden is set to meet with the big four congressional leaders at the White House tomorrow, as a partial shutdown is looming by the end of this week. Back with us now, our political panel, Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. So, Jeannie, the president is going to be there making his case, perhaps not just on avoiding a government shutdown, but also pitching aid to Ukraine, getting that supplemental funding package through the House. Can he do so successfully? What could he possibly say to change the mind of Mike Johnson?
Yeah, I mean, really isn't about changing Mike Johnson's mind. It's really about trying to deal with Donald Trump, who is lording over the House Republican caucus. And of course, you know, should the president meet? Absolutely. He has to do it for the optical reasons. But I don't see anything coming out of this meeting. The reality is that we are either going to have a shutdown on Friday, a partial one, or we're going to have a bipartisan coalition come together like they have, 4 times in the last several months to keep the government funded. And that's going to be a really tough thing to do with Mike Johnson having his job on the line. So this is really all about the Republicans in the House and all about Mike Johnson and the leadership at the top. Very little I can see that the president can do except make his case once again, particularly on Ukraine. But of course, Mike Johnson knows about that because he said he agrees with the funding on that.
So, Rick, give us the choreography here tomorrow. We already know they've done the classified briefing on Ukraine for Mike Johnson. We kind of had this meeting already a few weeks back. I guess it's a couple of months at this point. What's different tomorrow, or is this just an opportunity for everybody to speak to their own audiences? Mike Johnson will come out, criticize the president at the stakeout, and nothing will happen.
Yeah, well, we talk about this a lot. You need a deadline, something that backstops you in Congress to actually get anything done, right? There's no such thing as doing your homework ahead of time. And so this is what this represents. This is the backstop. This is, you know what? By the end of this week, we're in a government shutdown if we don't get something done this week. Now, it can be a lot of different things. It could be that one of the reasons that Speaker Johnson actually created this bifurcated process is to go ahead and let these, 4 or 5 agencies go ahead and shut down and use that period of time between the 1st and the 8th, when all the rest of them would shut down, to negotiate the best possible deal they can. That's real pressure, right? You've got a portion of the government that's shut down, not particularly critical, and you use that environment to try and shape a deal that would include something on the border and something for these for these countries like Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan. So you could almost imagine that that's actually his plan. Why else would you separate these agencies in the way that he's done it? But that being said, nobody seems to want a shutdown, but nobody has a specific plan to avoid a shutdown. Yeah. And so I've never seen a situation where we've had this much of a bogey between what can happen and what is happening.
Well, Rick is right to point out, Jeannie, the idea that these are the first 4 appropriation bills supposed to be the easy ones, the one that maybe it's okay if it, isn't funded for 7 days, whereas defense and the big bucket of spending on March 8th is the real deadline. But if they couldn't even get the easy bills sorted out in time, how are they going to get all 12 sorted out just 7 days later when this would be potentially, if they can't, a 4th kicking of the can down the road?
Yeah, it's stunning to hear where we are. Mike Johnson may have been thinking this laddered CR would do just what Rick was talking about, sort of force their hand. But this is not what is happening. What is happening now is that Chip Roy and the Freedom Caucus are saying, hallelujah, shut this thing down. Let's get to that deadline in April when you get the automatic cut, because they're not going to negotiate out bills with the cuts they want. They can't get those with the Democrats. They can't even get them with most of the Republicans. So go ahead and shut the whole thing down. Wait for the automatic cuts to go through. So I don't know what Mike Johnson thought was going to happen in this, bizarre laddered idea he has, but it's not working. And that's what we know now. I don't think it's going to force their hand at all. I think he's going to have to put his job on the line and work with Democrats to keep the government open.
All right, so we have just a minute here, Jeannie. How about some reverse psychology? How about Joe Biden dares Mike Johnson to shut down the government so he can deliver a State of the Union address with extra leverage 1 week later?
Oh, I love it. I used reverse psychology when my kids were little, so I am all for that. I recommend it strongly. I don't know if it ever worked for me, but I did try it an awful lot. Grow your hair long. Well, that'll look good, so hopefully the president tries it.
Go ahead, shut it down. Many thanks. Jeannie Shanzano in New York, Rick Davis here in Washington, our signature panel on Balance of Power. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. We'll see you back here tomorrow on both Bloomberg TV and radio.